So, Caves of Combat. The demo went live a couple weeks ago, and I've gotten a lot of good feedback since then. If you still haven't given it a try, it's free on Steam, and I'll leave a link below. There was a lot of progress between the last devlog and the actual release of the demo, so let me address some of the highlights. The largest set of changes pre-launch were the swath of new abilities and the systems needed to support them. These included some basic proof-of-concept abilities focused solely on modifying the player's stats, and some more interesting ones gearing towards specific playstyles or balancing risk and reward. With these new abilities, some intentional builds had started to form. A combination of movement and aerial-based upgrades produced a playstyle where the player benefited from maintaining aerial combos and leveraging their enhanced movement. Some of the abilities that support this build include the extra jumps from Ascendant and the new Juggler ability, pogos from Vaulting Strike, increased experience gain from Acrobatics, reduced gravity from Slow Falling, and new projectiles from the Groundbreaker ability. Outside of this build, there are some new standalone abilities that pose various trade-offs or require masterful play to succeed with them. The ability Give and Take requires the player to sacrifice some of their strength now to gain an unconditional boost later. Dulling Edge works in almost the opposite way, providing a large spike in power now, but with diminishing returns over time. The new legendary ability Glass Soul grants the player double damage on each floor until they take their first hit of damage. This can be very powerful in the right hands. While many of these new abilities were a success, some of them had to be cut from the demo as they encouraged gameplay that I felt was contrary to how I wanted players to experience the game. The first removed ability was Vengeance. This ability grants the player 1 damage every time that they take damage on the current floor. This resets when entering a new floor. It felt wrong to encourage the player to take damage, and it also felt easily exploitable by just jumping on spikes at the start of every level. None of that sounded very fun. Then there was Exhaustion. This ability gave the player a damage buff that decreased every time they killed an enemy and reset each floor. I didn't like how this discouraged killing enemies, which is a core aspect of the game. It also felt exploitable on boss floors where the player could just fight the boss first before losing any of their buff and clearing out other enemies. Granted, leaving other enemies around while fighting the boss would make the fight harder, but this was not the direction I wanted the game to go in. Finally, there was Stockpile. This ability grants the player a permanent damage buff every time they don't open a chest on a given floor. I removed it because it discouraged the player from exploring and finding chests, which should otherwise be a fun and exciting part of the game. Then there's a few abilities that made it into the demo that I still think are missing something. The Steel Souls ability just turns off collision with spikes, which is great for new players, but not very interesting. Lifesteal is straightforward and powerful. Every time you kill an enemy, you get 1 health back. It just feels too strong and too straightforward. But as a redeeming quality, it may change when the player decides to heal at a statue or not, so that's a positive. Then there are the projectiles from the Groundbreaker ability. Currently, these deal a fixed 5 damage, and in the early game they can be quite effective, but as you fight more tanky enemies in the later game, it becomes negligible. I think this calls for a new stat related to ability power that could scale separately from the player's main damage, but I want to be careful not to add too much complexity. Even just from this first batch of abilities, I've learned a lot about what makes or breaks an ability and how to consider its position in the balance of the game, how it changes the player's interactions, and how it synergizes with other existing systems. I've got a lot of ideas, but if you have new suggestions or modifications on these, let me know below. To facilitate these changes, I built out a set of classes for modifiable stats and stat modifiers. Basically, the final value of a player's stat can be calculated at runtime based on a list of active modifiers. Take for example the player's damage. Players start with a base value of 5 and a modifier tied to their experience level. Other abilities such as the strength buffs can be stacked on top of these modifiers and combined to produce the player's final damage output. The math behind this calculation works similar to how Balatro calculates the score for a played hand, where it first sums additive bonuses, then additive multipliers, and finally scales by the multiplicative multipliers. The implications of this Balatro-based calculation in an action roguelike seems to be that flat bonuses feel more powerful in the early game, and scaling bonuses thrive in the late game. As the duration of a full run will increase from the demo's 2 biomes to the plan's 6, I'm open to making changes to balance the player's progression throughout each run. Fundamentally though, these work. The new modifiable stats enable abilities and conditions that can change the player's health, damage, crit damage, experience yield, attack range, and more. Since each ability is responsible for calculating its own bonus, we can now display this in the UI too. However, the final value for each of the player's stats are not visible, which is something I plan to address, hopefully without requiring a GUI or menu separate from the gameplay experience. It's It's important that each ability is abundantly clear on how it affects a player's build and where your strengths and weaknesses lie. As a follow-up to these combat-related changes, I broke out separate crit damage and crit chance stats that can be scaled independently of the player's base damage. I'm still unsure if I want crit damage to be a separate stat, or if crit should always be something like 2 times your normal damage, for example. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. Internally, determining when to crit and signaling other systems that a crit has occurred is now passed along with the core damage struct. I've repurposed some of the juicier combat effects to trigger only on crits to give them more emphasis, along with a unique sound effect. Finally, with crits, I've not settled on whether the player should start with a chance to crit by default or if crits should be tied to certain abilities that increase your crit chance. Ideally, I want to have different playable characters in the final game, and each would have their own default stats, so crit chance could be reserved for other characters outside of the default Stoneblood, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this decision. Outside of gameplay, I implemented a system to track and store the player's lifetime stats into persistent storage on their device. Now the game keeps a record of certain key moments like your fastest win, your most common death, and what abilities you've unlocked. These player profiles can be expanded in the future to add challenges to unlock certain abilities, characters, biomes, etc. This will add a form of run-to-run progression that doesn't inherently make the player stronger, but instead allows for more diversity between runs. The inverse is also true, that new players will be faced with a limited set of abilities in their first several runs that would ideally soften the steep learning curve of a challenging roguelike. The last things that I changed before sharing this project were to improve the dialogue system and add a simple in-world tutorial. For the dialogue system, I wanted to make sure that the text was large and legible. I moved away from the old in-world display and opted instead for a fixed canvas on the HUD. Now when initiating a conversation, the gameplay HUD fades out and is replaced by the dialogue HUD. This reduces the visual clutter and focuses the player on the text and the input prompts to continue and end the conversation. The tutorial is boiled down to the absolute fundamentals that without knowing, the game would be unplayable. There are currently only 3 actions that I guarantee that the player can do before hiding the instructions: run, jump, and attack. I wanted to prevent a situation where somebody might give up before even entering the first level, and I think that this solves that. Once the content for the demo was ready, I devoted the rest of my time to marketing, albeit not too much. I started with the Caves of Combat website, giving it a fresh new look, updating the images and links, and adding a section specifically for the demo. Next, I produced an official announcement trailer that ended up going on the Steam page and shared across several social media platforms. I made sure that the players of the demo had multiple ways to provide feedback. I added quick links to the game's main menu to both the community Discord and a Google form. This ended up being worthwhile because out of the almost 40 playtesters that I had, I received the best feedback from the forum and the Discord. So thanks to those of you that took your time to make the game better. Overall, I'm happy with the progress of the game. I'm really grateful for everybody that's played the demo, especially those that left feedback, and I'm super excited to continue making Caves of Combat into a better, more engaging experience. Thanks for keeping up with the development, and I hope to see you in the next one. Take care.